Hey, what's going on, guys? The Horror Man back with a question. When is a horror movie considered a classic? I've been thinking about this topic recently, and I thought I'd discuss it with you guys. When is it that a horror movie can be considered a classic, or one of the greatest horror movies ever made? When is it okay to say that? I don't mean that subjectively, because we all have our favorites. I'm talking about status, objective status of a horror film. For example, there's Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. Whether someone likes the film or not, it's ultimately considered a classic and one of the greatest horror films of all time. The same could be said for Night of the Living Dead. I don't think anyone's arguing the influence this had on the genre. And not just zombie films, but horror in general. Now, both Psycho and Night of the Living Dead were released in the 60s, but does that really matter? As far as I know, these two were highly regarded not long after their releases. How about The Exorcist? This was impactful upon its initial release. So is that what really makes a horror movie a classic right away? I guess others, unlike The Exorcist, eventually lose their luster. But The Exorcist has seemed to always hold its place on the horror mantle. Though it might not be as scary as it once was, it's another film hard to argue about. Whether you like The Exorcist or not, it's ultimately a horror classic and considered to be one of the greatest horror movies ever made. But when did people start saying that? Like The Exorcist, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre had such a huge impact when it was first released that it sort of lived in infamy ever since. Then there's a movie like Black Christmas, which definitely wasn't considered one of the greatest horror movies ever made when it was released. As a matter of fact, people didn't even consider it to be a classic until maybe a decade or so ago. Growing up, I remember people not even knowing about this movie. Jaws, another one, a blockbuster at the time. But was it always considered one of the greatest horror movies ever made? I know of some people who don't even consider it to be a horror movie, which is just blasphemous. Regardless, it's still considered a classic. Halloween may be the best example of all this. When was Halloween first considered a classic, or one of the greatest horror movies ever made? I mean, it's universally considered so. That doesn't mean everybody loves it, because I know of at least a few people who don't. But people can't deny that it's considered to be one of the greatest horror movies ever made. When did that begin? Was it upon its initial release? Did it take 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? Halloween was released before I was born, but I was also young enough watching it, knowing that it was considered one of the best horror movies out there, and it hadn't been out that long. It's one of those films I grew up just knowing it's one of the best horror films ever, and an instant classic, I guess. I remember getting this 25th anniversary DVD, which was obviously the 25th anniversary of the movie's release. But even at that point, it wasn't like it had only just recently been considered a classic. It was always that way. There wasn't a time when I was alive when Halloween wasn't considered one of the greatest horror films. Is it a sequel thing? Are movies that quickly develop into franchises considered to be classics faster than others? That can't be the case, right? Because there are plenty of horror franchises that are not considered classics, and definitely not the greatest horror movies ever made. Is Friday the 13th one of the greatest horror movies ever made? It's definitely a slasher classic. Everyone knows what it is. Is A Nightmare on Elm Street a classic simply because Freddy Krueger is such a big horror icon? Just like Halloween had John Carpenter at the helm, A Nightmare on Elm Street was directed by Wes Craven, one of the greatest horror directors to ever live. Does that matter? Child's Play seemed to become an instant classic. This here is the 20th anniversary edition, but it was definitely a classic long before this was released. Which brings me to another horror film directed by Wes Craven, Scream. This is the movie, well, the new sequel anyway, that got me thinking about this topic. Maybe it's just the era in which people grow up, but it seems when you mention certain movies in the same category as other classics, you get shut down. If someone were to put Halloween and Scream in the same category, people would probably laugh. Well, some people anyway. But my question is, why is that? Aren't they both technically classics at this point? 2021, just last year, marked the 25th anniversary of Scream. I think it's done its time. Has enough time passed where it's okay to call Scream one of the greatest horror movies ever made? You don't hear a lot of people say that, and I don't think it's because they don't like the movie. Scream has some die-hard fans, and I'm one of them. As far as 90s horror goes, I don't think there's another movie that stands out as much as this one. Scream not only revitalized the slasher genre in the 90s, but it influenced a ton of copycat films. Some good, some bad. There is almost a separate subgenre inspired by Scream. Scream-style slashers. My point in all this is, older horror films seem to gain that classic description or greatest horror movie of all time praise much faster than more recent horror films. And by more recent, I mean anything released in the last 30 years or so. Why is that? When is a horror movie considered a classic? When is it okay to call a horror movie one of the greatest horror movies ever made? Once again, I'm talking objectively. I know not everyone likes Psycho, not everyone likes The Exorcist, not everyone likes The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, not everyone likes Halloween, not everyone likes Scream. But if you were to take a poll, you'd find that the majority considers at least most of those to be horror classics. Looking at the recent horror trends with remakes and reboots, it seems that eventually some of these older horror classics will become, I don't want to say obsolete, but just too old for the younger generation. They tend to prefer more modern-day horror. Which horror films will they eventually consider to be horror classics? What will they consider to be the greatest horror movies ever made? Think about it. It's been 22 years since the year 2000. Which horror movies released in the last 22 years do you think will become horror classics at some point? What do you think? Any ideas? Comment below and let me know. I know we tend to consider a lot of the horror movies we grew up with to be classics, but a lot of that is due to nostalgia. Does a movie have to be out for a certain amount of time before it can be considered a classic? When is it okay to call a horror film one of the greatest horror movies ever made? Let's discuss. Thanks for watching, guys. Hit that thumbs up and be kind, subscribe.